in continuation to what Savitri ma'am has asked from that, as you rightly pointed out, in the Telugu states, we are somewhere down the line in the rush to westernization, which is kind of assumed to be the modernity. We are losing out these things. I think it's time to do that. And I think your presentation actually gave us directions already. We are planning to work on the recipes, especially which you have said. And also there are plenty of art forms, both of the Telugu states. It's a lot of work. And rightly so, I did not, I've attended many of the NEP training and all this. I found that somewhere we are talking about so many things, but how to present our own case. English can be learnt through all this. Actually, the natives also will feel comfortable to talk about what they know. So I think this somewhere has to be incorporated in all of the what we call the syllabi curriculum. Somewhere we have to sneak in instead of talking about Peter Pan and Jack and Jill. Maybe we have to really work on that and come out as English. Thank you, ma'am. Very inspiring. Thank you very much. And
thank you so
I will
much.
hope you won't be offended. We might ponder you with so many questions. We are raring to go. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. And thank you, everyone else, for joining this session. I look forward to meeting you some point of time again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka, ma'am, for an enriching presentation interwoven with your personal ethnographic experiences. Thank you for making us understand indigeneity and the nuances of digitalization through Mithila art. Thank you, ma'am, for investing your valuable time to join us virtually. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much once again.
So next, we have our second plenary talk for the day by Dr. Sriraku Vandana ma'am on contemporary literatures. Before I invite the speaker, may I request Dr. Glory ma'am to present ma'am's profile to the August gathering.
Yeah, good morning, ma'am. I'm happy to read the brief profile of Dr. Vandana Raku R, Doctorate in Cognitive Linguistics, Jain to be the University, Bangalore. Dr. Vandana ma'am is a graduate in linguistics and a doctorate in cognitive science with a specialization in cognitive linguistics, understanding second language acquisition. Vandana ma'am graduated from Hyderabad Central University, Central for Neural and Cognitive Sciences. And ma'am acted as a guest faculty at the Hyderabad Central University. Vandana ma'am now works as an assistant professor and in the program coordinator for the Faculty of Language English with the deemed to be the university. Dr. Vandana ma'am current areas of interest include ELT, psycholinguistics and LLMS, which is testified with her publications indexed in Scopus. Vandana ma'am is the associate editor of European Journal of Advanced Computing and Management, forthcoming as a guest editor for Language and Linguistics. Athens Journal of Philosophy. Beside publications, Dr. Vandana ma'am has served as an invited speaker for International Multi-Conference on Social Sciences and Engineering, Indonesia 2023. Outside academia, ma'am is a practicing IELTS examiner with IDP India and a freelancer writer. Ma'am, I invite you, please occupy the chair, ma'am.
I am Dr. Vandana. I think at the outset, I must of course thank the KL University for this opportunity, the academic fraternity, and also the faculty members who have taken their time to be a part of this talk. I'm happy to be invited as a speaker, one, because it gives me the opportunity to impart the very little I know about cognitive linguistics, but it's also an opportunity for me to learn a lot from sharing a stage as big as this along with you guys. So the topic that I've chosen for today is very rudimentary, but at the same time, in a conference that focuses a lot on literature, that focuses a lot on digital humanities, I think we must speak a little bit about the crux of where all the literature, where all the other reality that we see today emerge from, which is, of course, languages. We cannot probably move beyond a little also from without speaking about the role of language in constructing reality, in constructing the social structures, and also in decoding and encoding what we speak and what we listen. So my topic is, I speak, therefore I am, what the mind reveals about language. Quite a strong statement when I use the word mind, but I'll come back to that. I'm a very comfortable bilingual, an extremely proficient bilingual. I can speak both Tamil and Malayalam. And I am also a polyglot in that sense. I know Telugu, but I'm of course very scared to admit it here because I'm not proficient as you people, the larger Telugu audience. I can understand Kannada, and I know a little bit of French and Japanese. That's just a little boost about myself, but there is a preface to it. When I say I'm a very comfortable bilingual, yet I chose English as a medium to speak in a conference like this. Now, when this happens, I have had this one thought throughout my graduation, post-graduation days. This one recurring thought I had. Despite being a very confident, comfortable bilingual, not for once, even once, when I'm even standing on this stage, has any other languages of my comfort zone penetrated into my processing levels, which means I did not have to use a Tamil word. I did not fumble upon a Malayalam word when I'm speaking here. Neither does any of the languages keep poking me when I'm speaking in English. Quite fascinating, right? How is it that a very comfortable bilingual can still shut off any other thoughts in any language and still prefer to speak in English? This is probably one of the marvels of brain, or I must say the mind as well. I haven't been inside Starbucks for a lot of times, but I have been there once or twice. And in all the times that I've been there, there is one thing that I've quite significantly noted. Any person who walks into a so-called posh cafe, or if you sometime happen to visit any of the cafes, you will see that most of the times we very inadvertently shift our choice of language. You do not place an order for chai, you place an order for tea. You don't say kapi, which is the actual South Indian term, but you rather say coffee. Suddenly it becomes latte, there's cappuccino, a lot of this. Now this is a quick language shift that we make, and nobody told us to do that. How does our brain actually sense, or should I say, how does our mind actually sense that the context will actually help me modulate my language as well? If a thing called mind actually exists, we'll look into that. Also, like the example I was giving some time back about being a bilingual, I'm making a lot of voices, a lot of noises with my vocal cords, with my tongue. I'm moving it here and there so that I make very sensible language, and you perceive it and you hear it through your auditory systems and make sense out of it. So what I'm speaking essentially is a combination of random voices, random noises, put in certain fashion so that it makes sense to you guys. I hope that is happening. If it does, this also has a greater, I think this also is a greater role of our mind. Now, if you look at it, we are attributing a lot of credit to the idea of mind. But if I really ask you to point out where exactly the mind is, something that does not occupy a physical space, something that's very non-spatial, how do we then believe the fact that mind can actually exist? If I ask you randomly to point out where the mind exists, most of us are likely to touch our chest, indicating that mind is probably here. If this is where your mind is, can this be identified as an organ in our body? Turns out we can't. Then why are we actually attributing a lot of role to the concept of mind? Or does a thing like mind actually exist? Now, if it does exist, what is its role in language? This is the small crux of what we are going to look at today as a talk. So my topic covers 4 essential, very crucial and significant questions that we'll be addressing today. First is the mind-body problem. Of course, we cannot move an inch about understanding language without understanding the mind or the body. The second is the mind's role in producing and understanding language. Like I said, if we actually believe in the idea of mind, then we must also look at how it contributes to our language processing, how language can shape thought and consciousness, and some scientific insights from cognitive linguistics and neuroscience. So a little philosophical. I promise you won't sleep. I've tried to include some examples so that we can relate, and a little more very scientific. So the first question, like I was asking, before we begin, there are two questions that we must perhaps understand to understand the entire talk. So I'll set the pretext. First is, can we actually understand a concept that does not exist in our language? Quite a strong statement, right? How do we actually think of something when a certain concept does not exist in our language at all? So quite often there is a German word which became quite popular after two famous celebrities used it on Twitter. The word is called Schadenfreude. I don't know if you've heard it. If I'm pronouncing it right, Schaden actually means evil, and fraud actually means pleasure. So together it's called evil pleasure, right? So evil pleasure is when the evil pleasure that you get out of seeing somebody experiencing something very bad. It's not something we haven't experienced. I'm sure all of us would have had little evil pleasures at some point or the other. I admit I did have. Evil pleasure is a concept that is quite common in most languages, but we might not have a probable word for it. But just because you do not have a word for it does not mean that you don't think about it or you have not lived that experience. But consider communities or consider societies that actually do not have the word for this at all. So how are we going to explain this concept when that concept does not even exist in your language? That's the first question we'll be dealing with. And the second is, like I said, does the mind actually exist? This is a thing that has actually happened to me. Have you ever stopped mid-sentence wondering whether you should address the person as chairperson or chairman? Because why man, right? We can keep it more gender neutral. Also, the second is more common these days when we actually have to identify, when we have to address somebody's identity. Would you use the word he? Would you use the word she? Today we have more gender, we have more people who identify in more than one gender. How then do we describe these people? Now imagine you live in a community that has no concept of gender constructions apart from he and she. I had actually posed this as one of the questions to my grandmother. I did tell her that, there are people who are not he and she. She was very amazed. She said, how can that happen? You're either born a he or you're born a she. But that's only biological sex, right? That's all we are talking about. That we've learnt it in schools and in biology. So we do have terms or pronouns for he and she. But then, of course, Hindu mythology does have words for, it's called Ardhanadeshwari, right? So we do have concepts of people who are neither female nor male as well. So we do respect them as well. But again, she was very amazed. She said that cannot happen because my language does not have a word for it. Quite ironically, she's the one who believes in God also. So anyway, when a language has no word for non-binary person, does it limit how we actually understand gender? Typically what happened with my grandmother as well. She couldn't understand genders beyond he and she because her language did not allow her to think about it. Now, when you cannot think about it, how will you even understand a society or a reality? So this is why what the mind reveals about language is so important today, because it shows us that our thoughts are shaped by the words that we have learnt. If you have not learnt a word, if you have not learnt a concept, then we don't know how we make sense of the world. Similarly, our words also reflect deeper social structures like patriarchy or stereotypes. Consider in English, we have words like man up, be a girl, don't be a child, etc. Now, these are phrases that's very unique to English alone. You wouldn't actually see an equivalent of this in probably your regional language. So when we keep using these words, when we keep telling somebody, don't behave like a girl, don't behave like a boy, etc., you are actually reinforcing stereotypes. You're telling people, how should you behave as a woman? How should you behave as a man? Changing language can actually change how people think about gender roles and identity. So, when you are a bilingual, this is one advantage that you have. You can think about two cultures at the same time. So it's quite possible that your language will have idioms and phrases that are very unique to your language alone. So in Kerala, for example, we have a lot of idioms and phrases surrounding the word coconut. Coconut there is supposed to act as a symbol of trust. So meaning that we have a lot of coconut trees in Kerala. Not for once has a coconut fell on anybody's head. You wouldn't actually see that news. that is what we say as trust. That is, I am giving you the nutrition to grow, and you don't cheat me by falling on my head. So that is the kind of association we have with coconuts. Now this is something that will make sense to somebody perfectly, somebody who's from Kerala. But if I have to tell this to a greater audience, it's not going to make a lot of sense. So changing, which means when you are actually a bilingual, it allows you a greater scope to understand the society that you live in and what are the things that is very valuable to that culture and society. Okay, now I'm coming back to the initial question, the mind-body problem. If we are to believe that, like I was asking, if I have to ask people to show me where your mind is, you're going to point at somewhere near your chest. Now, if you actually do that, isn't this part your body as well? The questions people grappled with initially was understanding the difference between mind and body. Are these both the same thing? Is it your intuitions or is it your consciousness, or does mind as an entity actually exist? So I'll go just about 3 minutes into telling you where this initial confusion started from. Two of the greatest philosophers of all time, I'm sure we know Aristotle and Plato. They are the 18th century philosophers. They were also great epistemologists who actually spoke about the idea of multiple souls. So they emphasized the fact that every organism that lives in the planet have something called multiple souls. So for plants, animals and humans, there are roughly about, for plants, animals and humans, there is about one soul that is common, which is the nutritive soul. Your nutritive soul is one responsible for your growth, your metabolism, all of these things. Now for animals and humans, we have something in common, which is the faculty of perception. So we all have a feeling for desire, for pleasure and pain. This is something that's common just to animals and humans. And what makes human is our faculty of reason. Now, faculty of reason is something that will not perish even after you die, even after a living organism dies. So for Aristotle, he said that after every living organism dies, whatever is a part of the body also dies. But what does not die is your soul. Your soul is, in that sense, very hylomorphic, meaning that it has a form and it has a shape. Therefore, every other time, on the other hand, Plato had the similar view, but Plato believed in the idea of reincarnation, which is metempsychosis, it's called, believed in the idea of reincarnation. So every time a living organism dies, his or her faculty of reason and logic does not die. It just passes on to the next living organism. So this is how mind actually typically works if it's something called mind exists. Now, therefore, mental phenomenon, all of the mental phenomena you see are very non-physical, or the mind and body are very separable. So there were two schools of thought. One which believed that mind and body are actually very separable. You can separate the mind and you can separate the body. Those people were called the dualists, who believe in the idea of dualism. Mind and body are separate. And then we have people who believe that mind and body are much the same, which is called monism. Now, with this thought came the idea of subjective dualism. I'll give you an example. Subjective dualism is more like this. If I have to ask you, what does pain feel like? Suppose you put your hand inside something burning and you get your hand injured. Now, if I have to ask you, what does pain feel like? Or what does a good music feel like? Most of us are likely to say a burnt finger feels like something like it's burning, my hands are bruised, it's painful, etc. Right? What does a stomach pain feel like? What does stomach pain feel like for you is not the same for me, right? What is good music? Some will say A.R. Rahman, some are going to say some other names, etc. In all these expressions, you are typically only expressing what a pain actually is. You are not telling the person what exactly a pain is. So pain is a very subjective thing. Unless somebody actually experiences the pain, you are never likely to understand what a pain feels like. But you will have adjectives to describe what a pain feels like. So this is what subjective dualism is. Most of the times, what we feel, like I was saying, when you say if you have a physical pain, you are likely to describe it as adjectives. But your body feels it very differently. It's intense. It's something that you cannot describe. Since you have these different sort of perceptions for mind and for your body, this is the reason why most of the times mind and body are considered to be very separate. Because the way you experience pain in your mind and the way you experience pain in your body is very separate. This is precisely the reason why mind and body are considered to be separate entities. So therefore, minds perceive intramental states differently from sensory phenomenon, and this cognitive difference results in mental and physical phenomenon having seemingly very disparate properties. Now, if actually subjective dualism is true, that is, if mind and body are actually separate, then language becomes the bridge. It is how the immaterial world reaches into the material world. Like I was giving the example of pain. If you have to describe it to somebody, it's only through language you can construct a reality for them. For somebody who have not experienced a heartbreak, it's only through language you tell them what a heartbreak feels like. So if mind and body are separate, then we have to look at it as a bridging gap. But language doesn't just reflect the world, it actually constructs it. So when we name something, we make it socially and psychologically very real. So perhaps the deepest function of language is not just communication, but it is also creation. So then what exactly is the mind's role in language anyway? So if you look at it, there are two processing that happens within the brain. One is the language production, and then you have language understanding. So in the first stage, the conceptualization stage, this is where all your abstract thoughts are there in your mind. All the abstract thoughts in its most raw, basic form. You hate somebody, it's there most raw in your mind, but you say it out more polished, right? But in what form are these thoughts saved? That's quite another debate. Now this process involves conceptualization, deciding what to say, what is it that you're planning to say, and formulation, which is selecting appropriate words, grammar, and structure. So this is a lexical retrieval stage. You make your thoughts more polished, something more sensible as well. And finally, the articulation stage, which is where you coordinate your muscles, your motor movements, your jaws, your mouth, your ears, everything moves in order to communicate what you're trying to say. So these functions rely heavily on working memory, attention control, and semantic networks stored in the long-term memory. So this makes use of all the stored memory, shared knowledge that you have. Now in the comprehension stage, you have perception. The mind decodes the incoming signals, like when I'm speaking, you are listening, whether spoken, written, or signed, by mapping them to a stored knowledge. So you already have an understanding of something, and then I come up with more inputs. And then decoding, all the auditory inputs you receive from me are decoded inside your auditory input, and then somehow it makes sense. And then finally, integration, where you break down all my syntax, the grammar, the semantic component, what do the words I say mean, etc., into something more intelligible. Because of the importance between language and thought, there are three things that we'll next look at. The interaction that investigates the complex relationship between language and thought. First is the existence of language as a cognitive process that affects our thinking. Thinking comes before language, and the learning of language interacts with the conceptual process that is formed before language use. Each spoken language may affect the system of thinking. So essentially, first we'll be looking at thinking without language, thinking before language, and thinking with language, the three things. So this is what we'll be looking at. Now, thinking without language. Now, the initial question that I asked was, how can you think of a concept if it does not exist in your language? I'll give you a couple of examples. But just a statement before that. Unlike animals, humans use language both for communicating and for symbolic reasoning. So if you look at chess masters or chess players, etc., they look at the board, they look at the chess board, and they can actually visualize or see their next moves. They can predict the next 10 moves at least by just looking at the chessboard. So this is visual thinking in adults. Necessarily, you don't have to articulate what you're thinking, but your mind still makes some calculation, right? So here, you're actually thinking without language. You're just looking at the patterns, you see the next you have to move this and move that. Therefore, a visual thinking will ensure that you don't think without language. And then there is emotional and intuitive judgment. This is something common to a lot of us. You might instantly feel that someone is trustworthy or that a situation is dangerous before you can actually explain it. So for this, you don't need language. You can actually look and say this person looks trustworthy or does not look trustworthy. More interesting is example from the Piraha. So this is the picture that you see are the Piraha tribes. Is the Piraha tribe. Now Piraha tribe lives in the Brazil, in the jungles of Brazil. So the language is very fascinating for a lot of reasons. But here, one significant factor that stood out made them quite famous among the anthropologists and the linguists alike was for the reason that the Piraha tribe did not have any concept of numbers. Now, every time, so there was Peter Gordon was a famous psychologist who conducted an experiment among the Piraha tribes. Now, what he essentially did was he placed some number of batteries, maybe 1 to 10 batteries and 1 to 10 nuts, right? Nuts, the in its raw form. Now, he then asked the Piraha community to count the number of nuts and associated with the number of batteries. The Pirahas were failed exceptionally in doing this. They could not move beyond 1 and 2. Anything beyond 1 and 2 was more or many, some or many. So they had just two words to describe numbers, which was hoi. Hoi, it's a very tonal language. So the language contains no words for or any discrete numbers, and there is approximate notion of quantity. Now this is also a guesswork. They believe that Pirahas can count 1 and 2, and anything more than 1 and 2 is many or more for them. So a somewhat larger amount or hoi. So they had two words for hoi. One is, if you look at it, the accent marker is on O. The second one, the accent marker is on I. And then they had a word called bagiso, which means either to cause to come together or a bunch. That's all. So anything more than 2 becomes a bunch for them or more for them. So that means their reality is simply some or many. They experience quantity very differently because their language does not name it at all. Then how then do they count? This is the same thing even with community called Hopi. Hopi occupies the North American part. Hopi community does not have a concept for time at all. How then are they going to understand the idea of time? How are they going to understand that they have to come to a certain place at 2 o'clock? Quite difficult, right? Similarly, also the Aboriginal communities of Australia, they do not, they depend largely on, they have words for directions, but not like ours. They don't say left, right. They say southwest, northeast, etc. So if you have to ask me to go out and take the northwest, I honestly do not know which is northwest. It's very difficult. But then, can you imagine a 2-year-old in the Aboriginal community of Australia is going to understand this much better than how we understand it. So that also gives a lot of insight into the cognitive processing levels of us versus them. But here there's no debate between the idea of intelligence. It's only that how our language, some languages are at a predisposition for people to think a little differently than how we may think about them. This has greater implications, of course. When you do not have concept for numbers, then how are you going to mark singular? How are you going to mark plurals? How are my verbs going to change with respect to the singular and plural of the subject? So, however, unlike the examples listed, thinking can actually continue without any verbal language. So, this is a little scientific. For example, people who have had aphasia is any injury to the brain in one part. So, for people with aphasia who have trouble speaking due to brain damage, they can still have complex thinking structures despite the problem involved in expressing them. So there was another research that was conducted among patients with brain injury. They had their conceptual understanding intact, and then they were asked to describe directions. They could actually use their hand gestures to show left and right, which means their spatial characteristics were still preserved. So this means you could actually think without language as well. So despite language and thought being very closely tied to each other, the expression of thought is not always achieved with words. People who have speech problems can express their thoughts in other ways using nonverbal communication. Now the next one, thinking before language. Now thinking before language is something that's very unique to the infants. Between 8 to 12 months. So the best example, so this was a major idea proposed by Jean Piaget, who was a psycholinguist, psychologist plus a psycholinguist, who believed that babies actually develop thinking before they even develop language. So he had concrete examples to show this as well. So the best example to understand whether thought or cognitive process exist before language is research on babies' comprehension of concepts and how they may change with language. So babies about 8 to 12 months of age were shown toys hidden under blanket. They were first shown a toy and then they were hidden under the blanket. So babies could actually ask or point to the blanket to give them the toy back to them. So this means they had a mental idea of what toy looks like, its characteristics, etc. So infants began to understand that an object will still exist even when they cannot see it. When a toy is hidden under a blanket, for example. This is a cognitive concept they actually grasp before they can articulate words like gone or hidden. So if you actually play this hide and seek with the babies can actually figure out that an object has disappeared from their eyes. But that does not mean that the object is gone forever. So they do have some sort of a mental representation, and you have to remember these are only 8 to 12 months of age, which means they have no language developed at all. So this shows that mind can form abstract ideas like permanence, absence, or cause and effect before language actually starts giving those labels. So cognitive development is the first thing that can happen even without language developing. Jean Piaget believed that thought, particularly in early childhood, develops very independently of language. He suggests that children first learn the cognitive structures and then use language to express these pre-existing thoughts. Pre-verbal thought, even without language, humans and other animals can engage in problem solving, planning, and other cognitive activities. Inner speech, this is a very common one. We all have inner speech within us. We can formulate thoughts in our minds before we can actually express them. Now, thinking with language, quite an easy one. Thinking with language actually came with two theories. It's called linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism. Now, the idea of relativity and determinism comes from Franz Boas, who was an 18th century anthropologist who laid the foundations of what is known as cultural relativity. Like I was saying, language is probably the key way in which you understand culture, social hierarchies, social structures, etc. So that means, in some sense, this must be connected to the culture as well. So according to this point of view, individuals see and perceive the world within the boundaries of their cultures. So the role of anthropology here was to investigate how people are conditioned by their culture and how they interact with the world in very different ways. To understand such mechanisms, we must look at culture and language so that we actually understand what they mean. So one of the common theories that came up with this concept is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, Whorf is Benjamin Lee Whorf, who proposed the idea of linguistic determinism. Now, linguistic determinism is one strong cultural relativity theory, which proposes that the structure of a language influences the way its speakers conceptualize the world. It also suggests that language can potentially limit the ways in which people think and perceive the world. Now, if you look at Japanese culture, for example, they have different words to address the speaker they are talking to, depending on their relationship, the personal relationship with the speaker, the status in which the speaker actually is, etc. So for them, it reinstates the fact that for them, language is very closely tied to the social reality and the culture they belong to. Similar is the case with the people who live in the Eskimo area, the snow-clad area. They have 7 different words to describe the word snow. S-N-O-W, the snow. We all know one form of snow. We know when it's not rain and when it's in a different structure, you call it snow. But actually, the Eskimo population have 7 different words to describe this one word called snow. Right? So it can have, each of the snow will vary depending on the structure, the size, the type, etc. So they have 7 different shapes, I believe, for snow. Now, we are a population who have no idea about snow at all. If we know, it's only one form. Whether it's in star shape, leaf shape, we don't care. We just call it snow. So then, how are we, until probably, for some of you who might know this, but until probably for a lot of us, we did not know that the word snow had actually 7 different names. How then will we actually conceptualize the idea of snow in 7 different ways? So we are eternally thinking of the fact that snow exists, but only in one form. So that is a case of linguistic determinism, that our language can actually shape the way we think about the world as well. Now, linguistic relativity actually is more quite interesting, but although it's the weakest point of cultural relativity, the language we speak influences the way we think about reality. Now, look at this example that you can see on the screen. If you can see, there are three shades of blue. How many of us can actually identify the 3 shades of blue, or do you think they are actually same? They're different. Okay, so then I think I might be a little colorblind, because I chose this example to show how many of us cannot distinguish between the broad spectrum of blue. Now, while at least the one on the right looks a little different, the first 2 actually looks pretty much the same. So, so there are about 7 different shades of blue that the Russian speakers can quite fluently identify, unlike us who know probably 2 shades of blue. One is dark blue and light blue. But they actually have 7 different shapes to distinguish the types of blue. Right? So this is actually true. It has greater implication for cultural studies as well. It was research has shown that household women or non-working women are able to identify colors much better than the men. The reason being, we are more acquainted with different colors of the masalas and everything else, saris, etc., which is probably very neutral for the men. So a study showed that people speaking different languages see colors also very differently. A 2007 study found that Russian speakers were better at color tasks than English speakers, because English speakers probably will define neutral shades better, but not darker shades. This suggests that the words we use for colors can also change the way how we see them. there is another picture, if you can see, of a little, of about some kids or cartoons standing below. If I were to ask an English speaker to count the number of kids on the screen, you would probably move from left to right. But if you are a Hebrew or an Arabic speaker whose writing system is from right to left, you are likely to count it from right to left. So indicating that it's not just the spoken language that can actually interfere with your counting systems and other realities, but it's also a written language that can influence. Your writing style can actually influence the way you think about your reality as well. So that means we may see the world within the boundaries of our language and the way and the think that way. Therefore, we can argue that the language we speak not only facilitates thought and communication, but also shapes and diversifies thinking. Now, underlying the context of all this is the word. Without word, of course, the grammar, everything else is important. Without words, we probably will not be able to even construct a reality or understand the world. So, a little bit about understanding the power of the word. So we know that language is not very descriptive. It's very performative and generative as well. So like I was saying, it does not it does not mirror your reality, but it actually creates a reality for you. So we literally speak our world into existence. And when we say something like this is how things are, we are not observing a fixed reality, but we are generating it in real time. There's a famous philosopher, J.L. Austin, who comes out with the idea of performative utterances in the book, How to Do Things with Words. Now, in this, for example, when someone says, I apologize, you are actually not, they are not describing what an apology feels like, but they're actually enacting it. You are saying that you are taking responsibility and I'm sorry for it. So you're basically not describing an apology, but you're enacting it. So in her analysis of Judith Butler, suggests that aspects of our identity, such as gender, etc., are not inherent traits, but are constituted through repeated linguistic performances. They play a very crucial role in forming our identities. This is why some of the textbooks today, especially some of the textbooks in Kerala, came under radar. I think in the SCRT curriculum came under radar because the textbook actually used very repetitive illustrations on what ugly looks like. So, for example, ugly was always a person who was black in color, and Ramu was always playing cricket, but Sita was always cooking in the kitchen. So when it starts reinforcing certain kind of stereotypes like this, your language actually has the potential to do it. When you start reinforcing realities or creating realities like this, you're most likely bound by stereotypes as well. So this is actually the generative power of word. How you can use your language in order to shape somebody's thinking into something more efficient, which is the reason why we also have pep talks. We also have motivational speakers, how they make use of words in order to uplift you from something very sad into something more motivational. Now, we can never also ignore, while we actually credit the mind, the brain, the body, and our articulation systems, etc., for the language processing that's happening, we can never truly move away from understanding, taking some insights from neuroscience and of course cognitive science. There are a couple of, just the basics. So if you look at it, neuroscience primarily relies on just these three areas predominantly for language processing. So there is something called the Broca's area, there is a Wernicke's area, and then the motor cortex. And within cognitive science, if you look at it more, little bit not so scientific, is the idea of conceptualization, your idea generation, the abstract thoughts. Formulation is your linguistic encoding, and articulation. So this is how neuroimaging work has provided us with some insights into the contribution of distributed areas in the brain to different language operations, including the processing of meaning, sound, structure, and speech melody. Until for a long time, it was believed that brain was one entity that was just capable of producing language with no specialization of different areas. But there has been very recent studies that was conducted among patients with brain injury, and also postmortem brain studies have showed us that any injury to a particular area in your brain can significantly hamper some aspect of your language as well. So collectively, studies have shown that the left dominant brain region in the frontal, temporal, and parietal cortex is very crucial for language processing. So out of this, these are the two areas. The Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe, in the front portion, and the Wernicke's area is your back portion, responsible for comprehension. The Wernicke's area is more about language comprehension, located in the temporal lobe. So, few research and psycholinguistic studies have shown that language production and comprehension are active, constructive processes, not mere decoding of information. So, there is also a Levitt speaking model which demonstrates that speakers plan, conceptualize, and lexically encode messages, indicating that we don't express reality, but we build it mentally before it is even uttered. Neurolinguistic studies, on the other hand, also, of course, reinforce this view, but with brain imaging studies that show that Broca's and Wernicke's area, along with the other networks, work together in order to integrate the semantic meaning into contextual cues. Because without context, even in the example that I gave of the coffee shop, your language wouldn't make sense if you don't understand the context. Who are you speaking to? Where are you? Etc. This suggests that comprehension involves predicting and inferring, not passively absorbing information. So neuroscientific research has also demonstrated that distinct yet interconnected brain areas such as Broca's area for speech production and Wernicke's for comprehension coordinate through neural pathways like articulate fasciculus for a better sense. Psycholinguistic studies reveals that language processing is very incremental and predictive in the sense that if I actually leave a sentence open, something like honesty is the, and then I leave it open, we know that it's the best policy. So that way it's very repetitive, it's very incremental, and it's also predictive, with humans anticipating upcoming words based on context and grammar. Cognitive science explains this through models such as working memory framework, where the phonological loop temporarily stores verbal information, enabling syntactic and semantic integration during conversation. So we do have working memory, which is responsible. For example, the working memory is the memory that stores your OTP for timely, and it just goes forever. You can never recollect that ever again. So whenever I speak, I know that there are a lot of information on my long-term and my short-term memory, but the next word that I speak automatically comes from my working short-term memory. So, like I was saying, until the 19th century, it was very commonly believed that human brain is one single unit without any functional or anatomical specialization. This view was challenged after there was discovery in patients with stroke-induced brain lesions. Now, Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, that's where the name comes from, are two renowned historical figures in the field of early language research. They linked stroke-induced deficits in language production and comprehension with post-mortem analysis of patients' brain. So they tried and analyzed patients' brain, of course, after they were dead, to understand what part was responsible for what sort of a language processing. So Broca found that lesions in anterior part of the left hemisphere were associated with impairments in language production. So this observation was complemented by the Wernicke's work relating lesions in the posterior part to deficits in language comprehension. So any lesion that you have in your Broca's area will lead to something known as non-fluent or expressive aphasia, which means your comprehension, your understanding will still be relatively preserved, but your production will be significantly impacted. Maybe you can speak words, but no grammar or sense in them. A lesion in your Wernicke's area will also lead to Wernicke's aphasia. It is also known as a receptive aphasia or fluent aphasia, because fluency comes with good amount of grammar. Once that is compromised, that's where Wernicke's aphasia stems from. This type of aphasia is characterized by difficulty in understanding language, both spoken and written, while speech production may be very relatively fluent and grammatically correct, but often lacks meaningful content. So together, we know that these regions actually make possible the bidirectional process of meaning making, where we actually articulate perceptions into words and interpret words into perceptions. So this is a bidirectional process. Now, this neural interplay is also very fundamental to the hypothesis that we saw. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis premised that language actually shapes our cognition. So cognition is basically knowledge. The more precisely and richly we talk about a particular incident or we talk about a particular occurrence, the more distinctly it can be conceptualized and shared, influencing both our mental models and collective social realities, which is what I was saying. Most of the pep talks or most of the influential speakers you see, they actually use words and language very richly, enabling people to conceptualize their reality a little different from what they were feeling, which is also the reason why psychologists also have very powerful statements to make to elevate our mood. Now, in this sense, Broca's and Wernicke's area are not just processing centers, they are neural gateways through which linguistic construction actually occur. And so, what have we looked at? We have actually traveled from neurons to narratives, from Broca's area that crafts our words to Wernicke's area that gives them the meaning. We have also seen how language is not just a mirror of reality, but the very frame through which we actually see it. When our brain shapes language, it is also quietly shaping our reality. So therefore, you change the words and you can change the world you also live in, both in your mind and in the mind of others, which is the reason why textbooks are kept more gender neutral, why textbooks cannot be very gender centered or sexist, because one association of the word, or like I was saying, in most cases when you have to describe a verb or when you have to describe an adjective, it's always Ramu who is playing and it's always Sita who's cooking. This sort of a reinforcement of gender and the kind of work they do can actually shape the way people perceive about our culture as well. So when our brain shapes language, it is also quietly shaping our reality. So we therefore will have to choose our words wisely, because every sentence we speak is not only describing it, we're also building it. My concluding remark is, when we speak, we're not merely describing the world, we are actually actively constructing it. We know that the Broca's area is responsible for shaping our thoughts into words, while Wernicke's area shapes the meaning those words carry. Together, they are architects of our perceived reality. The words we choose frame our experiences, define our possibilities, and even set the limits of what we can actually imagine. So if language is actually the lens through which we see the world, then refining our language means also refining our reality. The question, therefore, we must leave with is not just how does the brain process language, but how will we use the language our brain gives in order to build a better world. And that's all. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, ma'am. So now the floor is open for any questionnaire from the participants online and offline. So thank you so much, ma'am. That was an excellent presentation. Please
excuse me, ma'am.
Please, ma'am. So dealing on the scope of yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, this is Monica from Trichy. Can I ask a question?
Hi, sure, ma'am, please.
Hi, ma'am. Good morning. It was a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask you one question, because you were talking about Broca's and Wernicke's area. You said it's important to restore phonological representations, as in to understand the brain, and an intervention should focus on restoring phonological representations, right?
Right.
It should focus on language representation and all. So in that case, it should also focus on restoring the functional connections, isn't it, ma'am? Linking the Broca's and Wernicke's area. In that sense, then what do you think an intervention should actually address?
Absolutely. I just touched upon the Broca's and Wernicke's because otherwise it will get too scientific. But then the neural pathways are of course responsible, because if you look at it, I think the cerebellum and the portion at the back, I forget. Okay, so there are many other pathways also. For example, the one that connects the Wernicke's and the Broca's area, which is the articulate fasciculus, that's also very important for establishing. So without you can't just articulate anything without understanding and without comprehending them, right? So of course the neural pathways are important. You have the hypothalamus, which is responsible for memory recollection, that okay, I've heard this before, maybe I can relate this point with that. So these are neural pathways. Of course their functional role is most significant. So with just Broca's and Broca's and Wernicke's areas, we can't do much. The pathways are definitely very important.
Yes, ma'am, but I'm just asking how the intervention should focus on restoring these functional connections, as in they can they can work on auditory scaffolding, or they can work on visually engaging stuff like colors or something. So what do you think is the best way to connect this functional areas of frontal and temporal lobes?
That I think is quite, it falls under something known as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy also. When you're trying to better somebody's speech production or articulation, yes, there are ways in which people do it. One that I think might work is visual stimulation. I think that will work wonders. The reason why we store or we recognize certain things much better than others are the peripheral factors, like for example the visual form of it. Maybe you've heard somebody's sound a lot of times. So that's why advertisements are a great way in which people remember certain brands better than other. If you look at Netflix, I know, for example, anything that comes, a red font that comes under a black background, I know that it stands for Netflix, right? So peripheral cues are also important. Visual stimulation, I think, will go beyond what any other kind of therapy can work. I hope that answers.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
That was really interesting.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you one question, ma'am. When this is related to cognitive linguistics, can you give us one or two ideas or scope for projects?
Okay.
Scope.
In cognitive linguistics,
Yes,
you say?
ma'am.
So there are a lot of tasks that people do within cognitive linguistics. One that's quite interesting and has not been done much in the Indian context is what is known as the Stroop task. A Stroop task is where, for example, I show you a word, green. It's written GREEN, but it is written in blue. And then I ask you to name the word, and then I ask you to name the font color in which green is written, which is blue. You are likely to say green only. You don't say blue. And this is usually done in a short testing time. So this is a testimony to the fact that it's usually the language that supersedes any kind of information that you receive. It can happen otherwise as well, but we have to check that in the Indian context, because a Stroop task is something that's quite commonly done in order to understand the role of or the priority of the mental lexicon. Is it the language, or is it other cognitive process that interfere your thoughts? That's one thing that you can think of.
That's fine, ma'am. One more connected question is that a person who is into literature,
Right.
can they pursue in cognitive linguistics for project area or any kind of publication? Will that knowledge be sufficient? I mean to ask you.
Absolutely. I think collective memory, there are a lot of memory and trauma studies in literature.
Yes.
I think that could be one way we could look into, but specific topics I'm not quite sure. But I know a couple of people who are working on trauma studies but are from the cognitive science perspective. Might have to look into it, but more scope for anthropologists, I think, who try and decipher the culture and language together. Or maybe why was a certain literature written, or a certain literary text written in this fashion? So for example, Ramayana has many retellings, immense amount of retellings. In each retelling, the Ramayana, Ravana and Sita have a very different role. The Thai Ramayana focuses a little differently than the Indian Ramayana. So maybe we could look at how culture interplays with the written texts, and how do cognitive science also understand this in the perspective of relativity and determinism. That's possible.
That
Yes.
was really wonderful, Dr. Vandana.
Thank you very
very
much.
much for visiting KL University.
Absolutely, my pleasure, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Vandana, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Your presentation made me understood that there is an intersection of neurolinguistics and cognitive linguistics. Now, a little preface, when you spoke about Safarov hypothesis,
Yeah.
that reminded me Lernberg's theory of hypothesis in neurolinguistics. Now, as per Lernberg's theory of hypothesis, language acquisition should completed by age of 12, right?
Right,
Now,
absolutely.
whereas NEP 2020 recommends that third language should be introduced after age of 12. Now, how can we bring this point? Because even I mentioned in one of my papers that as per Lernberg's theory of hypothesis, we need to proceed further. Whereas there are other studies indicating that Lernberg's theory of hypothesis, there is a different argument for it that should not be considered. How far this point is true, whether to be considered or not to be considered? This
Sir,
is the doubt.
I think both Chomsky and other linguists, actually, one of Chomsky's predominant premise is the fact that language, any kind of language or any amount of language, can be learnt until you're 12 years of age.
That's
So
right.
which is called the critical period hypothesis.
That's right.
I think once we have this structure to a language, once we have the understanding of the structure of a language, it's quite possible that you can learn any other language, which is the reason why they say infants are born with the ability to produce any kind of sounds. So there are sounds in African, for example, click sound in between sentences. This is something I can never do. For example, even Arabic speakers have glottalic sounds, something that you say, Shah Rukh Khan, it's not Khan, it's something else, and I can't do it. Yeah, it's from the epiglottis, right? So these are sounds, research has shown that infants are perfectly capable of producing. But when this is not expressed in their language, this subsequently becomes very silent, or it becomes repressed, because there is no use for me to use this sounds in my language. So if the basis of language learning is established, it's quite possible for us to learn any kind of language, which is what Chomsky talks about innate period hypothesis, that every human is born with the ability to speak a language. Every human has faculty of learning language in his or her body. Where there are examples of Attic and feral children, they are made to grow along with wolves, and apparently they pick up the sounds made by wolves, and they can perfectly understand what sound did the wolf just make. So perhaps when this base is established, it's quite possible for us to learn any other language, because the structure for all, I know, the Devanagari script or any other remains the same. So yes, it's quite possible, I think.
My point here is, I strongly support Lernberg's theory of hypothesis, but there are research associated which is against to it. I don't understand how far that should be considered. This is the only doubt I have for almost 2 years. The researchers that are against to Lernberg's theory of hypothesis. But it's clearly visible as per neurolinguistics on Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Language acquisition is possible over there. Now, I don't understand why there is against to it. This is the question that I have been in mind for years.
Maybe I'll come back a little more learned to answer your questions, sir.
Even I need to study on this point. Right. Thank you.
So thank you so much, ma'am, for your excellent presentation on the scope of linguistics, cognitive especially. Literally, your presentation has thrown light on the very nuances of unconscious cognitives to systematic cognitives, and the very details of language to via thinking via language, and the various aspects of crucial aspects of cognitive linguistics have contributed to the very essence of our conference today. You have added that flavor, ma'am. Thank you once again. Now please accept our token of gratitude. So I request for felicitation. So I request the convener, Dr. S. Lavanya ma'am, co-conveners, Dr. M. Madhusudan sir, Lata ma'am, Dr. Raja Ambedkar sir, to please join the felicitation.